Let's talk to John, pronouns he, him, calling in from Nipple Clamps, who says, just wants to talk about trans people. And it says here, I don't understand how a male can be a woman. John, you're on the line with Forrest and Erika. How are you doing today?
Good. How about you?
Never had a bad day.
That's what's up.
That's what's up.
So
that's what's up for it.
Right. I appreciate you calling in and putting your questions out there and like being open to asking things. The first thing that I would ask you is you do understand that sex and gender are different things, right? Or do you disagree with that?
Yeah. Do you?
Yes. No. So the way that was phrased, I do hold the scientific academic standard consensus view, yes, that sex and gender are different things and that they're not necessarily congruent. That is like well understood for the past like 100 years in biology. So are you saying you don't agree with that? Because that's where we need to start the conversation then.
Yeah, no, I agree that sex and gender are, I guess, different terms for sure. Can we start with what's the definition for sex?
Yeah, sure. So sex is referring to the sex. Both of these are multidimensional, but sex is referring to males, females, and intersex people. It's talking about the physical, physiological, genetic, chromosomal, hormonal, anatomical, whatever other physical characteristics of males, females, and intersex people. Whereas gender is referring to the socially constructed norms, behaviors, roles, power structures, socioeconomic status, whatever, associated with girls, boys, women, men, and non-binary people. And so those things are separate constructs, which are multidimensional in nature and serve different roles. So it's not just that they're different terms. They are actually fundamentally different things that very often line up, but don't necessarily line up and don't always line up.
Okay. And as far as sex goes, you mentioned 3 of them. So
I said males, females, and intersex people. Yeah.
Okay.
I said males, females, and intersex, and that is the limitation of our language. Yeah.
Okay. And obviously the 2 main ones would be male and female. The intersex is more of a genetic, mutation or something that happened.
Not necessarily. No. So yes, the main ones are male and female. That's going to cover the vast majority of people. But about, if the most conservative estimate out there from the UN is like 1.7% of the population falls on a varium of a continuum of variation. Those are the words. A continuum of variation between these poles. And what's really important to remember is because when you say it that way, it's very easy to say, okay, well, 1.7%, that's tiny. There's 2 things that are important to remember. Number one is that even the 2 poles are not cut and dry, because we're talking about, no matter how you slice sex up, it is a multivariate construct, which has a ton of different factors going into it. Not a single one of those factors is solely determinant of the outcome, and not a single one of those factors has only 2 options. And so even if you say, okay, this is 100%, this is male, this is falling into the male box, 2 different people who fall into the mailbox may still have different reasons for being in the mailbox, because those factors are different. I'm going to start saying female box instead of mailbox. It sounds like I'm sending a letter to sex, and that's weird. But like, if you put 2 people in the female box, they're going to have different reasons for being there. It's not necessarily, okay, they both had this super standard 6th grade template of sex determination, right? And of course, none of that is necessarily going to imply anything about gender, because you cannot boil gender down to, nor can you predict gender by sex alone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sex, okay. And you saying male and female, the intersex. What would we consider intersex?
So intersex is an umbrella term for people who fall outside of these simple binary categories for a variety of reasons. And so intersex conditions, also sometimes called DSDs, or differences in sexual development, can happen for a variety of reasons and cause a variety of effects. That's why most of them, you talk about like Turner syndrome, Swire syndrome, De La Chapelle syndrome. Well, the word syndrome is not the same thing as the word disease or disorder. What it fundamentally means, that word syndrome, is that here's this presentation of symptoms or whatever phenotypic physiological change, whatever the case may be it destructive, harmful, helpful, whatever. It doesn't have one solid root reliable cause. There's several different causes, or we don't know exactly what causes this thing yet. That's why we use the word syndrome. And so DSDs fall into these, a lot of them we use this word syndrome because there's a variety of ways. When we talk about sex, we are almost always talking about development. And there's a lot of ways in which the development can switch up a little bit, and you can still end up 100% in this, male or female category, or you might not. You might have some parts of you that are male and some parts that are leaning more female. And that's why, especially in biomedical sciences, we're really careful when we're talking about somebody. We'll try to, if possible, we'll talk about this is anatomically female, phenotypically female, genetically female, chromosomally female, hormonally female, whatever, because no one of those things is necessarily always going to imply many of the other things, and none of them are the same thing as the word woman.
Okay. And as far as that, so let's say a fully developed male organs, member and the testicles and the female's vagina and uterus and all that. A fully developed would just, that's nature's, right? Two options, and then there's variations. Like nature's trying to get a fully developed organs for functional, function reasons.
If you want to look at it that way, sure, that's a fine way of looking. It's there's different ways of thinking about things like this in biology. So you're coming at it from what I would call tree thinking, which is thinking of like an evolutionary functionality and like, okay, so the point of this is for sexual reproduction. This is where we're trying to go. And there was some sort of aberration, some sort of thing that happened here. Sure. But still that has nothing to do with gender at all. And so,
I just want to cover sex real quick before we get to gender. I just want to, stick to sex real quick before we get to gender. So we know, because I understand there's variation.
If you talk about something like this, it's important to remember that these are human beings that we're talking about here. These are not just lab rats. And we say, okay, well, this looks.
Of course, there are people, and
so it's just important to keep that in mind, because when the other thing that I forgot to mention, when we talk about this is 1.7% of the population. We have a global population of 8 billion people. So 1.7% of the population is 136 million people. That's a population the size of Russia that doesn't fit into your strict binary box. And so that's why we use these terms, just to kind of as a blanket term to cover all this stuff, because there's no way to just say it all together.
I wouldn't use current population. I would just use every human that's ever existed and probably will exist. Because
even more.
Yeah, right. So, like I said, this has nothing to do with people, whether, let's say a woman who's unable to bear a child, she's no less than a woman, right? Or the ones that have a uterus, right? They have children.
So that's the thing, is that even if you talk about, you bring up childbearing and uteri, that's a great example of why this is such a frustrating argument to have a lot of the time. Not that you're frustrating. It's funny to point out that whether you separate sex from gender or not, even if you think that sex and gender are synonymous and binary, which again, I can't stress enough, is not the current scientific view, right? But even if you hold on to this outdated and parochial view that sex and gender are synonymous binary things, still not every woman has a uterus, and not every person with a uterus is a woman. There are plenty of people out there that have a uterus that are not women, period. And that's beyond whether you separate this or not, whether you have new understanding of science or the old understanding of science, doesn't matter. That's just a fucking fact. And you also hit the nail on the head when you said, someone who's infertile, it's this dumbass argument that I get all the time of well, if you put 100 trans people on an island, you're not going to have a civilization in 100 years. It's okay, what if you put 100 postmenopausal women on the island? What if you put 100 infertile women? What if the women had Mullerian agenesis? What if the women just chose not to have children? Does that mean they're not women anymore? And it's only when we're talking about trans people that
Right.
people, and I'm not saying you're doing this, I'm just, it's only when we're talking about trans people that we tend to use reproductive ability as a barometer of human rights. And it used to be these exact same arguments. You'll notice these are the exact same arguments with the exact same language and the exact same intention as it used to be used to argue against same-sex marriage a couple of decades ago. Oh, these gay people, they can't have children, and they can't, are you even a real man? And like, who's the man in the relationship, and it's all the same shit. And now we get to blend homophobia and sexism into the diarrhea in a martini of transphobia. And that's what we're dealing with, today.
Okay. I just
That
wanted to
is so
just, put a stamp on was Erika about to speak?
I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I thought somebody was about to speak. I thought I heard Erika.
No, John. I was just laughing because Forrest called it a diarrhea martini, and I was like,
Okay.
"What is that? That's so gross." No, he's doing it. He's doing a phenomenal job. He knows this area better than I do. So he's definitely the guy to talk to about this kind of stuff.
Okay. Now, as far as like this, I just want to put a stamp on the sex thing so I could talk about the gender part. But so we'll just stick with female and male. And then there's variations that would be intersex, but one, they can lean closer to one or the other, or just, right? Is there ever like a 50-50, like a full on,
So the problem is, and I want to be
fully developed?
Yeah. That's a really good question. And I'm gonna give you an answer, but then I'm gonna have to explain a little bit of the answer because I know I can see the comment section before the show ends, and I know how people are gonna hear. So it is somewhat subjective when you say questions like that about like, is there a perfect 50-50? Like, because humans are the ones who made this system up, there's no, it's like with species. There's no such fucking thing as a species, right? We just draw boxes around patterns that make sense. And that doesn't mean that the boxes are real, and that doesn't mean that the patterns are real. And so like, if you look at, for example, my undergrad genetics textbook, which I can pull out if you'd like and read this, it talks about like, here's somebody with De La Chapelle syndrome. They have XX allosomes and they develop as a man or as a male. And so we would just call them male more or less for convenience because they are anatomically and phenotypically male. And so that's the language that we're going to use for them. And so it is kind of just like your decision, whereas that person could say, listen, I'm chromosomally female. I'd prefer it that way. And somebody else could come along. We have actually had a caller on this show who said that someone with De La Chapelle syndrome who has XX allosomes but develops phenotypically and anatomically male, this person who has penis, testes, vas deferens, all these, or ductus deferens, pardon me, all these things, is actually a woman because sex and gender are the same thing. And if you have XX chromosomes, you're a woman. And that was his stance, is that, okay, well, these people are women then. And so like, there's still argument to be had here. And so the answer to your question is probably, yeah. When we talk about intersex people, we would kind of default one way or the other. There is some outdated terminology. We used to use terms like, yeah. Like we used to use some terminology like meta male or meta female for those things. That's kind of outdated. People don't really like that anymore. It's just kind of gross now. And so intersex is just kind of the blanket. And usually it's just defined, or you box somebody in based on just like how they're presenting themselves. You would assume that these are congruent, and it's all fine. And I just want to put a caveat on that. Yeah, I just want to put that caveat on there to say that it's not all completely arbitrary. It is kind of fuzzy, and that makes it beautiful and fun. But like, I know for sure there's going to be some fucking transphobe that's going to hear them be like, so you just think that sex is just totally arbitrary? We can just call anybody whatever we want. And like, I just want to make sure that we cover the bases here. That like, that's literally how all science works forever, and we're not doing anything different here.
No, I was just asking if there's like a fully developed penis, testicles, and then vagina and uterus on a single person.
Yeah. So yeah, sure. So like, take for example, persistent Mullerian duct syndrome. During development, as you're growing, there's this common misconception where people are like, well, we all start off female, and that's not fucking true.
Right.
We actually start off with the equipment for both directions. And so what people do like to say is we do start off with a cloaca. that forms what looks an awful lot like a vaginal opening, and unless directed properly, external genitalia do tend toward vulva. And so like that's kind of where this idea comes from. But when we're talking about like internal genitalia and like how these things actually develop, you get what are called Mullerian ducts and Wolffian ducts, and you develop both of these. And if left unchecked, Mullerian ducts will develop into uterine tubes. They'll develop into the uterus. They'll develop into the upper part of the vagina. I think the upper third, if I remember correctly. And ovaries come in at a different time as a gonadogenesis thing, based on primordial germ cells. If you left unchecked, Wolffian ducts will develop into spermatic ducts. They'll develop into ductus deferens. They'll develop into parts of I think they form parts of the prostate, if I remember correctly. Doesn't matter. The point is, what happens typically is that one of these will be persistent and one of these will reabsorb. But that isn't always the case. And so in example of someone with persistent Mullerian duct syndrome, you would have someone who has XY allosomes, has a penis, has testes, has ductus deferens, all these things, and also can have all or part of a uterus and uterine tubes and even the upper third of a vagina.
Okay.
And so, you can have a situation like that. Right? No, there's no such thing as that, as far as I know, in humans. And even if you look at like gonads, so like you can have testes or you can have ovaries, or you can have ovotestes, where one half of the organ has ovarian tissue and one half has testicular tissue. And this is another thing, just to get ahead of it, is we talk about hermaphrodism in other animals. The term hermaphrodite is a slur for humans, but you can find in the literature, like it'll say like case of true hermaphroditism in humans, and they're usually talking about ovotestes. They're talking about like, okay, this person actually has the reproductive structures for both, they just don't produce the gametes or whatever like that. And there are even some species of mammals where they all fucking have ovotestes. That is the normal ground state for like I think it's like the European moles and shit. Like all the females have ovotestes. And
humans will never be able to reproduce asexually, like lizards or something.
Yeah. So if you talk about whiptail lizards are a very common example, where they are entirely parthenogenic. The entire population, the entire species is just females. Right. And yet they are still reproducing, and they're doing it through parthenogenesis. They're reproducing asexually, but they have to have sex to do it. So one of them will take on a male role, and they will copulate, and that interaction releases the hormonal cascade that causes them to develop an egg as if it were fertilized. And it's fucking awesome. And so that's like gendered behavior, basically, or sexual behavior. It's kind of cool. So that's all that. And like, yeah, you have that in humans. And it is very funny because like the transphobes will talk about and the binary essentialists and all these people, they'll talk about it as like, no. Sex is very binary because you either have sperm or eggs. And it's like, okay, well, what if you don't have either? What if you're infertile? Well, your body is like organized around sperm or eggs, right? So therefore, okay, well, then what about ovotestes? Well, that doesn't matter because they don't produce sperm or eggs. And it's like, well, what about the body organization thing, right? Like, I thought that mattered. So, yeah, it's one of the reasons why this stuff just doesn't really work. And one of the reasons why this stuff just isn't a strict binary. It's fuzzy and it's gradient. And it's messy,
I got you.
And that's the coolest part about it.
As far as a fully healthy male or female that has a fully developed testes and penis and a vagina and a uterus and ovaries and all that.
You just use the word typical.
Typical, right? So okay, typical. So you're saying currently now we don't no longer call one of them a woman and one of them a man?
So generally speaking, you could. You like more often than not, you can default to that. But man and woman mean different things than male or female. Right? Fundamentally, those are different words that have completely different meanings.
So gender, how many okay, then what's we got the definition of sex. What's the definition of genders then?
Yeah, so gender, as I said earlier, is the socially constructed norms, roles, behaviors, expectations, etc., that are associated with women, men, girls, boys, and non-binary people. And so what we're talking about there, by the way, to the person talking about Richard Dawkins says other things, call in, numbers on the bottom of the screen. The thing about gender is that like they, generally speaking, sex and gender are synonymous. However, gender, by its very definition as a social construct, is non-binary. And there's a million ways you can prove that. And so,
So,
as we are, I'm sorry, what were we saying?
so I'm saying, because I did have to look up the word gender, and I see that it was like coined in like the 50s and 60s, something like that.
Yeah, it's a newer. So we've known about trans people, and we've understood a little bit about the disjunction of sex and gender for actually about 100 years. The real understanding of it as a thing started in the 1950s with, I believe it was John Money, who was starting that, and that dude had some fucking terrible ideas and did some horrific experiments. And it's kind of like Freud, where it's like, okay, we wouldn't know a lot of psychology without Freud, but also fuck Freud. You know what I mean? And so, like, it's the same thing as it is with a lot of scientists, where it's like, okay, this person was early in this field. They were on to something, and they also did some really fucking stupid shit. And now, skip forward a few decades, we've learned a lot more. And so what we understand now about gender is that this is this thing that is, it's gender is a descriptive thing, not a prescriptive thing.
Okay.
And this is another thing that people tend to not understand, but I'm happy to break it down, is that when people describe themselves using words like man, woman, whatever, they are also defining that term for themselves as well, because of what gender is and how it works, because it is such a deeply personal thing, because it changes from culture to culture, from generation to generation, from person to person, from day to day, because it is so fluid by its very nature. It's a little bit harder to pin down. So we can define it very easily. I can give you the definition of man or woman or whatever you'd like, but it's not going to be because just which one would you? So either one.
Man.
A man, like to define the word man, because of what gender is and because of the way it works. A man is a person who aligns their gender identity with, or you should say, like, is aligns their gender identity with the identifies himself. I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this. Who identifies themselves as and aligns their gender identity to the behaviors, roles, and possibly physiology that they associate with masculinity or with manhood. It would be the best way to say that. And so it's not just a man as anybody who calls himself a man. It's that a man is somebody who is aligning their gender identity with and identifying themselves as, like, lining up with the roles and the norms and the behaviors and the presentations and the performances and maybe also the physical characteristics that they themselves are associating with manhood. You know what I'm saying? And so, like, for me and you, for example, this is just to flesh this out, to show what I mean. I guarantee that like, masculinity to me is different than it is for you. And I don't know anything about you, and I can make that distinction. One of my best friends in the world, Jesse Jerdak, right? The dude hits the gym regularly. The dude has biceps that weigh as much as my whole body. He feels very masculine when he's out there pumping iron and being this fucking awesome 6'8", jacked to shit super bro. And if you go to the next person in the gym who also has that same thing, that they feel very masculine when they do that, they might also be a douchebag to women and be very domineering and very sexually predatory and want to control social situations, because that's what men do. Whereas Jesse is the biggest fucking sweetheart in the world and wants to hug everybody he meets and just wants to make people smile and will punch a Nazi without any provocation. It's just like, that's the nicest guy you've ever met. And so here we have these two people who are united in their masculine image of being this very buff, very big, very scary looking guy, but completely separate in their masculinity. Whereas, Jesse has a very kind heart and a working brain, and Andrew Tate fucking doesn't. And then you compare both of those to me, where I'm this fucking squirrely 6'2", like 185 pounds of just Jack Russell Terrier squeezed into a monkey body. And I don't fit many of these things, but I align with Jesse's masculinity in being kind and in being helpful and in uplifting marginalized people and seeking feminist solutions. But I certainly don't align with his masculine image of needing to go work out. That's just not how I see myself as a man. And so, like, if you pick any two men, any two women from this culture, you're going to have a different concept of masculinity. And if you compare either of us to a man from the 1500s, when men wore powdered wigs, men wore high heels, men wore facial makeup, men wept with emotions and would weep in distress and would faint when they were overwhelmed, and all these, the manly weeping and the manly fainting and the handkerchiefs and all the, certainly we would not be okay with the kind of frilly whatever that came along in those times and call those things manly. Nail polish was invented for, I believe it was the Byzantines, that they would paint the nails of warriors. The warriors had the different, and the different nail polish colors denoted different military ranks. Certainly, we're not doing that shit today, right? And so these are all things that, like, yeah, please.
So far as that, like you were saying, it's a social construct.
Yeah.
And it can change, like you said, you know, back then they were wearing nail polish, high heels. So would you say that sex is true and gender is not true? Like a not true thing is it could be whatever, you know, wherever the wind blows, that's where gender is going to go?
No. So great concept to think about this with. No. It is changing and it is fluid, but that doesn't mean that it isn't true or that it isn't reliable. A great way to think about this is sexuality.
Like boys, like right? For instance, to say a boy likes, or boy color is blue and red, right? That's not true, because you know my favorite color is purple, and I don't see that as a girl's color. Even though we talk like that, that doesn't make it true.
And before the 1940s, yes, that's exactly what I'm getting to. Yes.
That's what I was picking up on here.
Yeah, you're talking about gender roles and gender norms and things and lumping them with gender itself, which is common, because if you take gender and break it down, it's not just its own unique individual thing. There's gender identity, which is a fundamental part of who somebody is, which is different than gender expression, which is how they are going to present that gender to the world, which is different than gender roles and norms.
So let me get to the main thing, because as far as sex, so like a male who says they're a woman, what do they mean by that? That's what I'm kind of confused. What do they mean that they're a woman and they're not a man?
Then they mean that, number one, sex is irrelevant in this scenario because we're talking about gender. If we're asking, are you a man or a woman? We're not talking about their sex, we're talking about their gender. And what they mean by that is that they identify as and align their gender identity to the behaviors, characteristics, roles, and maybe physiology, or maybe not, that are typically associated with femininity or with womanhood. That's what they mean. They understand the same way you can take
feminine and masculine is two different things, I would say, than gender. Because there's definitely men who identify as men and they're feminine.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Take for example, a great example of this would be like, you know, if you have two different women in the same room that are both cisgender, and one of them is very frilly and girly and wears pink and glitter and all sorts of stuff, and the other one is a total tomboy that is a professional lumberjack and doesn't do any of those things, and like they're both women, and they both have totally different concepts of what that means to them. And I don't think either of it is like, well, I got a vagina and that's it, all there is to it, right? They have totally different
definition to gender then. Because if a woman can be any number of things, that's what I'm saying. If a woman can be, like you said, a girly girl who likes pink, and then, you know, tomboy, black, you know, stuff like that. If those, and they both consider themselves women, and they both have different interests, and they're, you know what I'm saying? So it's like woman is whatever you want it to be. Because the spectrum of woman is so grand that it's like, you know.
It's not to say that there is no definition. It's not to say that there is no definition, but it is to say, like I said earlier, that these terms are.
objective definition?
Yeah, it is you are aligning yourself with the things that you associate with womanhood or with manhood. And so or with
And that could
neither
be
if you're
anything.
non-binary or with both or whatever. And that could be a
That's what
lot
I'm
of
saying. It could
anything
be
and it
anything
should
though.
be a lot of it. It could be anything because if I was aligning myself with the roles and behaviors and everything of manhood in the 1500s, guarantee you wouldn't think I was very manly today. And so like
No, I would still
that is
think you're a man.
absolutely what it means.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
But
I don't see as like far as let's say gender roles and interests, and maybe I'm using the word man to deal or in women to deal with sex, using those terms because they're so it's like it's almost been a common thing until like 2015 or so that like somebody there's a girl who I know who doesn't like girly stuff. I still would consider her a female or a woman or a girl, even though she doesn't have the interest as, let's say, somebody I know who's, very girly, likes to get their nails done and this and that, pink, likes to wear their hair and do all, they're always considered them both. I don't see that being the defining factor as you being a woman or you being, a girl or whatever, because I see like there's people who believe in social constructs and then there's not. So it's like I'm like one of those people who don't see it as that. Like you liking a certain color doesn't make you, or you like to cook, or you like to do this. But I would still consider you based off of your gender because I'll say a gender. I would say a woman is this is how I define it. I guess this maybe that can help. I see as a woman or a man being a human male. So a human male is a man. A human female is a woman.
Okay. So then how the problem with that is that you are now kicking the can down the road. And it's important to remember that sex and gender, because sex and gender are different, transgender people and intersex people are also different things, right? So we shouldn't conflate the two. But we can use intersex people as an example as to why that kind of thinking doesn't work. So let's say man.
Well, I'm saying, right? I'm using, hold on, let me say this real quick. So what I'm doing right now is I'm using a concrete, I won't say concrete, but a solid definition for a man because I'm saying two things. One, human, and then the next, male, versus whatever you identify, whatever you think a man is. Because a man could be, there's a guy who wears a suit, and there's a guy who just wears a t-shirt and basketball shorts. I would consider them both men, regardless if one thinks one is more masculine or, it's really just opinionated. So I'm trying to figure out why change the word man and woman to be anybody's opinion? Like why we've been using the word for a long.
If your phone fell asleep, I can no longer hear you. It says you're calling on the web caller. So if your phone fell asleep, you need to tap your phone and make sure. Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah,
why let anybody define? So what I was saying, well, no, I got the gist of what you're saying. And what I was about to say is that like, you're asking, why do we just let people define these things? We already do. And we always have is what I'm trying to get across to you is that like, because the way that we have always used these terms, right? The word man has, or the word male, I should say, the word male has a meaning, right? These is a biological construct, and you're not going around checking what's between people's legs before you call them he. You're not checking people's chromosomes. You're not checking people's hormones. You're not checking people's testes. You're not checking people's development in the womb. You're not doing any of those things. You're going based off of their presentation to you, right? And so that changes across cultures and history. There are plenty of different cultures that have had totally different constructs of what men and women are, who have had totally different definitions of these things, who have recognized third genders, who have recognized transgenders, who have recognized all these other things. It is just in your culture that you have been used to doing this in what seems to be a simple way. And yet, you could have somebody, like I said earlier, with De La Chapelle syndrome, or with persistent Mullerian duct syndrome, or with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or with whatever else, or 5-alpha reductase deficiency, whatever it may be. Typical. And yes, sure. But what I'm trying to get across to you is that
let me kind of like narrow down where I'm really coming from. So on somebody like a
These
regular
terms are
dated,
descriptive, not prescriptive, and you agreed to that a minute ago, and now it sounds like you're backtracking on that and saying you no longer agree with that concept.
Agree with what?
That these terms are descriptive, not prescriptive.
As far as like male, like sex and gender?
Gender terms, not sex terms. Gender terms are prescriptive. Sex terms are not.
You know, you said I agree with what? I'm trying to.
You agreed a minute ago.
Agree. Yeah.
Sex terms are prescriptive. Gender terms are descriptive. You agreed a minute ago that gender terms are descriptive, not prescriptive. And now it sounds like you are backtracking.
I agree that there are two different terms, like word-wise, and that's why I try to get you to define sex.
You also agreed with me that they are different things.
To the male part or to the gender part. Like the sex.
You also agreed with me that they are different things, and you agreed that they're not necessarily incongruent. I thought you did anyway, and you agreed that they're non-binary. And a minute ago, when you were asking me to define
differently, or let me define what I'm getting at, because maybe maybe I did, or maybe I misunderstood you. Because like I said, sex is a different word, right? It's 3 letters, genders. They're different terms, and they kind of have a different meaning. So yes, I do agree with you to that, but maybe not to the full extent to where. That's what I'm trying to get at. Like we could define sex. We did that very easily because it's biology. It's kind of set on certain elements. There's checkbox list, but of course there's variations and stuff like that through like you said, syndromes and stuff like that. So that's fine. And then we get to gender, which I'm trying to understand. If it almost seems like gender doesn't have a definition if it's only based off of what the individual describes to, because we already agree that a female who is very girly and pink, right? We say that's girl stuff, and then we also say a tomboy is also girl stuff, which a tomboy is wearing basketball shorts and t-shirts and sneakers, which we would consider boy stuff. I guess that's what we call it, tomboy, but nobody really sees that.
How do you let me? It sounds like the self-identification thing is the big hang up here, that this is so subjective. Everybody defines this, therefore. So let me ask you a question, because what I think you're missing is that social self-identification is a necessary part of social identity in general. So how do you know if somebody is a Republican? What is the definition of a Republican?
I don't know. I don't know if you hear me.
Are you not familiar with what Republicans are?
I mean, I know it's a political party, I guess, but I don't know the definition. I'm not. I don't.
Okay. What about Democrat?
If someone was a member of the Republican or the Democrat Party, how would you know? Like, if you were to guess, if I were to present you with a random person and I were to say, are they a Republican or a Democrat? And you can't look at what they voted. You can't see their ballot. You just have to guess on the basis of the things that they believe, the way that they dress, the people they hang out with, maybe the hobbies that they have, maybe the types of entertainment that they like. What does a Republican or a Democrat to you look like?
I don't know.
Well, describe one for me. If I said,
I don't have a description because I don't know.
But I'm okay with you not having a description because there really isn't one. Because at the end of the day, a Democrat is a person who aligns their political identity with the concepts of Democrats, of the Democratic platform, right? It is a self-identified thing. It's something that is fundamental to them. It is their morality. It is their conscience. It is their social identity that you don't have a concrete objectives thing for. It's just who they are. What about this? What about somebody who is bisexual? What does that mean?
They are interested in both male and female sexually.
They're interested in men and women, sure. What if they've only ever been with women?
You said bisexual. You just call them male and women because isn't bisexual based on the sex?
That's not how that works, but it doesn't matter. We'll skip over it because it's not the point.
Hold on. How is that down? I want to, because I don't want to be confused on that part. I want to. So bisexual can be somebody who likes what?
bisexual means that they are attracted to either gender. Gender and sex are different things. We use the word sexual in that, but that's not actually what it means literally. Psychology is fraught with terms that aren't that great like that. It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. The point is,
hold on.
For example,
this might help. Hold on, let me get to this.
Oh my
this might help.
It won't help. You're gonna miss the point that I'm trying to make. If I
right,
told you right now that if I told you that I'm bisexual, then that would mean that I like both men and women. I like boys and girls both, right? What if I have only ever been with women ever? Am I still bisexual?
Again, based on how you're using it, I don't know how you're using it. That's what I'm saying. I'm using it in a different way when I hear bisexual. I'm thinking you like both. You like same sex. Homosexual, wouldn't it be the same sex?
John, it's so not important. I'm going to change my language to make it easier for you so we can get past this. If I tell you that I'm bisexual, that means I like males and females, right? So what if I have only ever been with females my entire life? Am I still bisexual?
No.
Yes. Because sexuality
you can like it, your actions, I guess. You can, sometimes, I don't know if...
Right. You don't have to. I don't have to go fuck a dude. I don't have to go fuck a dude to be gay, right? I could be completely homosexual and never have sex with a man, and I could still be homosexual. And you don't have a way to test that. It's all because that is a part of my fundamental identity, my sexuality, who I am. And sexuality is so deeply personal that it can be difficult sometimes to have one definitive term for a sexuality that can be blanketly and easily applied to any other person and mean the same thing. And also, different cultures throughout history have classified and categorized and recognized sexualities in different ways. Sometimes they didn't recognize certain sexualities at all. And also, sexuality is historically associated with socioeconomic status and power much more than it is associated with either sex or gender, just like gender is. So, like, sexuality is a great way to understand gender, because while sexuality and gender are different things, they are both historically more associated with socioeconomic status and power. They are both non-binary terms. They are both very deeply personal and rely on self-identification for understanding and for identification and for communication. And they both change from culture to culture, from person to person, from day to day, generation to generation, both in terminology and usage. That's what I'm trying to get across to you. It doesn't matter like what the words we're getting hung up on here. The point is, self-identification is a necessary function, not just of gender identity, but of all forms of social identity. So, like, you're getting hung up on a molehill and treating it like a mountain.
No, I'm trying to really explain. I haven't really been able to speak. And, I really want to hear what you're saying, but I really want to.
You've spoken quite a bit, I promise you.
I haven't, but so my thing is, right, as far as let's deal with, you said homosexuality, whatever, or gay, whatever. So somebody who is a male who identifies as a woman, and you were to have sex with them, wouldn't you be gay? Wouldn't that be homosexuality,
No.
even though they identify as a woman?
Nope. Because sex and gender are different things. And so when we talk about sexuality,
what is same-sex marriage then? What would you call that? That's what I'm trying to define words. If it's not about sex, like you're both males,
and you know what
is that called? What is two males that get together sexually called?
And I would also throw out there that, like, that's even just my usage of the term, because again, as I just got done explaining, sexuality is also a fuzzy thing that has different meanings to different people. Some people would, if you talk about pansexual versus asexual.
Subjective. You're saying it's not subjective, but then you're saying it's subjective because you said your definition.
I'm saying the labels are somewhat subjective because these are deeply complicated, highly ramified, very personal things. And so it's hard to make one label that can accurately cram everybody's feelings about this one thing and then also say that about just one person, let alone a whole group of people. So for me, no, because I'm consistent with the psychological understanding that homosexual doesn't necessarily actually mean sex to sex. It means gender to gender. That's the usage of the word. It's a poorly defined word. It's not poorly defined. It's a a poorly named word, kind of like the word hysterical. Hysterical doesn't literally mean your uterus is acting up, even though that's what the word actually translates to. But that's just an outdated psychological term. We used to not separate sex from gender, and we defined homosexuality as the same sex, and we kept the term even though the understanding of sex and gender have changed. So homosexual behavior is sexual behavior with the same gender. And so, no, I wouldn't consider someone living with a trans person of the opposite gender homosexual behavior.
Okay.
Somebody else might, and I would think they're wrong, but like that's not really an argument for me.
Okay, all right, cool.
John,
now, gender. Go ahead, Erika.
Slide in real quick? Okay. Sorry. I thought you said hold on. I sorry. My thing is really short.
My thing is go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
That's my
bad.
cabbage while Erika talks to you.
Yeah. So earlier, I was listening to what you said, and I really think you were. It seemed to me as an outside listener, and this is not my forte, so I've just been sort of peeking an ear in and trying to keep up as I draw cartoons. But what I kind of gathered is that you were totally on board with this idea that when we're talking about sex, right? There are, typical males and typical females, and then there's a whole lot of people that fall in between. And that's what gives sex its bimodal characteristics, right? We were on the same page with that there's typical males, typical females, and a whole lot of variation in between. Are we good on that?
Yes, and it's really the variations are based on what?
The variations could be based off of I guess, genetic differences at various levels of development is how I would describe it. Maybe that's not the right way to do it, but it could be, on the SRY pathway, it could be gonadal, it could be chromosomal, it could be a bunch of different things that cause, you to have a sort of a non-typical intersex status, if that makes sense. When we're on the same page with that, right? That there's variation in how humans develop sexually. You can be a typical male, you can be a typical female.
How people develop in general. Someone could be born with one eye, and stuff like that. So, but typically it's trying to have, humans trying to have two eyes. But sometimes they're born with one, or three, or whatever. But it's not that that's what they, right? So
let's put that aside for now and just agree on the fact that there is variation in humans and how we develop sexually, like how our sex develops. We're chill on that. Okay, cool. So my question, I guess, moving on is like, why can't that same variety that we accept for sex exist in gender? Like, why can't it be that, typically a man exhibits these characteristics, and maybe that's depending on the culture, as we all agreed, if you're in the 1500s, it's going to be things like, fainting or being highly emotional or whatever. But if it's today, maybe it's liking monster trucks and playing football. They're characteristics that we associate typically with men. But at the same time, I know women who like monster trucks and like football, right? So you can say that there are generally characteristics that can identify men, and there's generally characteristics that identify women. But at the same time, we can, as we talked about earlier, recognize that there are tomboys and there are feminine men, and there are people who kind of like all sorts of different things, don't neatly fall into a box. But unlike sex, which is something that you can investigate objectively with a microscope or with a syringe, gender isn't really something that you can say they're definitely a man or definitely a woman, right? Like there's just not a way to do it if gender is something that's based off of gender roles and the historical time period and how you present and all these.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you. Say again.
No, I'm liking the way you're saying it, and this is my point to that. Right. I mean, if you want to, I don't know how far along you're going to finish your part. I don't want to cut you off, but I do want to say something before,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so
you're good.
Just like you said, there's, like you said, tomboys, girls that like monster trucks, whatever. And you're asking me, why can't there be that variety? And I'm saying that there can be, but that's not, the variety is not what I'm defining, I guess, me or how people typically been doing it until like 2015, where they say that's a man or that's a woman. They're not usually going based off of how you dress or anything like that. Because I will call somebody a woman or female based on however they dress. Really, the whole thing was that if you were a human female, that you were a woman. or you're a human male, that we would call that a man, right? And then also we use man as far as like age, age too, because we wouldn't call a boy, or even if they identify as even if it was a trans kid, we wouldn't say woman or man, because we kind of typically use that for older, right? And then also we also use.
I think to Erica's point, we talked about intersex people, right? There's males, and then there's females, and then there's intersex people, which are hard to define, and they're fuzzy, and they defy categorization sometimes, and all these things. So also, can we at least agree that there's such a thing as non-binary people? There's men and there's women. And then if you are going to sit here and say that sex and gender are linked, then what gender would you apply to an intersex person?
Okay. As far as intersex, I guess, if they're both, then they're like the exception. But somebody who's fully developed male claiming to be a woman based off a social construct, which I don't see it as it's true. Like, I don't see that a woman likes pink or that. So you think you're a woman because you like your social, that's what I'm saying. It's almost like trans people.
You're saying that you don't believe. So you're saying you don't believe that gender is a social construct.
Huh?
You're saying you don't believe gender is a social construct.
No, it could be, but I'm saying I don't see a social construct as true. Like, you are this because you like that. Because just like we could say somebody who's a tomboy and a girly girl, they're both females or they're both women, based on, and they're not fitting the typical social construct, right? The tomboy is not, but you wouldn't say they're not. So just if they identify as one.
I wouldn't say that, because they still fall under my definition of woman, which is that they're a person who aligns their gender.
What about their definition? So it could be, so who's definition? Are we go by our own, or we go by the other person's?
No, it's the same. If they are a binary essentialist and they believe that sex and gender are the same thing, and they're just the most transphobic person in the whole, J.K. Rowling's definition of what it means for her to be a woman is encompassed in my definition of woman as well. Because my definition includes roles, genders, roles, norms, behaviors, and also potentially physiology or anatomy or whatever else, physical or social characteristics that they associate with womanhood. So that includes her definition. It just also includes everybody else's. It is the best way to summarize the fact that this is a descriptive, not a prescriptive term.
What I'm saying is, people before, like I said, before this time, when somebody calls somebody a woman, it was never really based off of any, like you said, social role or,
right, and
identity.
That's what happens when we learn new things.
Right. Okay.
We learned new stuff.
That's what I'm saying. It's changed.
So
the word has changed.
Nobody's arguing that it's changed. We learn new stuff.
I'm pretty much arguing that because you guys are wondering why people are having trouble with this, is because you guys, the definition has changed and you guys already jumped on it and you already accepted it even before it hit society. And society are still confused because the term, nobody's really defining the term, because there was no definition. It was like, no, a woman is just a human female, regardless how she dresses, regardless how she carries herself or her interests. That's what it was. Now, if you want it to be something else, to where it can be whatever you want it to be, that's a different thing. And self-identification, that's not the problem. Because the real problem comes to nowadays.
Can I interject really quickly here with an example that believe it or not, I think I actually heard this in a ContraPoints video, but she was getting the example from Blair White. So you're going to have to forgive me that this is, I guess, ultimately coming from Blair White. But Blair White is a trans woman here on YouTube. Oh, it's fine. I'll just tell you, Blair White is a trans woman here on YouTube, and she's conservative. And she had this conversation with Ben Shapiro, who's like a known conservative guy. And they were discussing exactly this. They were discussing the utility of like self-identification and pronouns and stuff like that. And, Blair came at it from a utility standpoint, right? So she is like super feminine presenting. Like, you saw her out in the middle of the nowhere, you would be like, that woman is walking by, whatever. And she
Right.
asked Ben Shapiro at one point, she was like, you might, because Ben Shapiro had said something kind of rude, in my opinion, where he was like, oh, you're a biological man or whatever. And Blair responded and she was like, if we were to meet at a restaurant and, you're meeting me and you see me in the distance, but you don't actually know my name. You're like, oh, I'm sitting with my friend Blair. That you'd say that woman over there because she's shown up in a dress and she's very feminine presenting and she's basically giving every signal that we universally associate with what a woman is, right? There's a utility in that. So this is a classic example, at least from what you were just saying, of a case where what you would be saying would be kind of the silly way to go about this. If Ben showed up to that meeting and he was like, oh, I'm here with my friend Blair, he's over there, then the person who the waiter would have no idea what he was talking about. Right. So
Right.
I'm not saying that presenting is the most important thing or even an important thing. I'm just saying that even conservatives can recognize that there's a utility to this, that we recognize certain things as archetypally women and we recognize things as archetypally men. And whether or not that's good or bad is kind of to the side. The point is that gender is seemingly, at least insofar as I can tell, very diverse in how people experience it. And because of that, it can be really tough to say that this is objectively what a woman is and this is objectively what a man is. Like, I've tomboy cousins, and if I was like, oh, what is a woman to you? And she would probably say a woman is, someone who plays soccer and likes bugs and likes chocolate ice cream and likes to play in the mud. And that's how she would describe it because she considers herself, a young woman. And she's a kid, but she would think that she would think that she's a grown up, but she would think she's talking about her. Right? So the way that people understand gender is necessarily put through a filter of like who and what they are. Right. So, sex can be a part of it. And I don't really think Forrest, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, because maybe I'm not up to date, but I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with saying that a lot of the time, typically sex and gender are going to overlap in our society. That's just the way our society is set up, right? Typically, if you're a typical male, you're going to be a man. And typically, if you're a typical female sex, I'm talking about sex here, you're going to be a woman.
Yeah.
But because people have a lot of variety, there's also going to be stuff in the middle. And that can be with regard to sex. We're talking about like folks with intersex conditions, or it can be with regard to gender. People who were assigned male and transitioned to being female, or people who were assigned female and transitioned to being male, or people who don't really relate to male or to man or woman, right? And it's like I think that the way that I approach this with people is that it's not like we're trying to change the definition. It's just that we understand a little bit more about how people feel about themselves, and it's kind of a cool thing to recognize that. You get what I'm saying?
No, that's cool. I understand that as far as just self-identifying. Like, I have no problem with anybody identifying as whatever they want to identify. The problem is where it leads to is that's why people don't want to change the definition, because this goes into like the bathroom stuff, the sports stuff. So for an example, Forrest, if you was to right now identify as a woman, exactly how you look, exactly everything you look, you're a woman, would it be okay for you to go into the women's locker room?
No, here we get into this now. So here's the thing,
that's
man.
What it's like, because if we're using the words woman, it's like, okay, well, I identify as a woman, so therefore I can go into this place or I can join this thing. And I don't care. Like, if we was to change the words or give another word for, like, the way I was using woman, if we was to make a new word for that and replace it, all right, so woman it could be this, okay. Well,
I'm frustrated by the fact that like we've been going for I think your phone died again. We've been going on an hour, and like I feel like I've had to repeat myself 30 times, and I feel like Erika just really laid out really, really well, like kind of a summary of all this, and now we're just kind of moving on. We're kind of moving just on to the next thing.
This was going to lead to. This was
I'm all for gender neutral bathrooms.
You say it again?
As are you. Right. I'm all for gender neutral bathrooms, as are you. And also I don't think the question would be, yes, if I was a trans person, I would want to use the bathroom that aligns with my gender, but I'm also, as you are, John, I'm a big fan of gender neutral bathrooms. So like,
Okay.
I don't see
Yeah,
the
for sure.
point here, nor do I see the issue of like, how are you going to check how's the enforcement looking? You know what I mean?
No.
What if I have
That's what I agree with.
what if I'm a cisgender woman? What if I'm a cisgender woman with PCOS and I grow facial hair and you
Right.
and you don't know, and like, you know what I mean? Like, I just don't get the argument, and I just don't see. I think you should call back and have a chat with us another point, because we still have several callers waiting and we have a ton of super chats. But like, I think you should go back and re-listen to this call and see how many times we answered the question. Then you would ask the same question again. And I think you should call the Transatlantic as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what I was going to say too.
And talk to trans people.
I can give you my best.
Erika.
Oh, sorry. My bad. I think I was talking over somebody.
No, he was talking over. I was trying to hear what you were saying.
Oh, whatever. It's fine. I'm not forced, and I don't think forced is, I don't think you're trans. I'm not, but I'm just saying we're not the best people to really be talking about this exact subject, because I'm coming at it from the perspective of like, I'm a like cis woman, and I'm sitting here trying my best, but I probably don't know this issue, this subject is the better word for it, as well as the folks who are on the Transatlantic Call-In Show, who are going to be able to give you a much better in-depth look at this, and probably frankly explain it better than I did. But I really, for what it's worth, I don't think you're coming at this from a malicious perspective. I really do think that that you want to like get the issue. So I think they'd be happy to take a call from you.
Yeah, no,
so
like
too,
I said,
and it's similarly, I'm coming from a perspective of biomedical sciences, not as a trans person. So,
right, no, but my summary for this was really going to get to, because we don't have a defined word on women, that because we label stuff like the women's bathroom, male's bathroom versus female's bathroom, male's bathroom, so that leads to people, okay, why? Like if it was me or Forrest decided to whatever identify as a woman, now we're putting ourselves in a place that is mostly going to be females. Even the way we look, we don't change nothing about ourselves. We don't get no surgery. It just we identify with this word. So now we put ourselves in a place where it's mostly really based off of sex. Even though we call it the women's bathroom, the women's locker room, it's really a bunch of females in there. It's really for females. Sports is really for female sports. We use the word woman so much, and we now have a new definition.
So then,
I agree with our new definition. That's right, the new definition, that's fine. But because we still stuck on the old definition, and where people are like complete ourselves, we got the new definition for women, or how people are trying to use it now, that it could be anything, and then how people are normally using it. So it's like, okay, this man, this biological male that we call a man, is now walking to the women's bathroom. You're saying woman, but we're really talking about female's bathroom. And that's what people have a problem with. Males walking to the female's bathroom. Because you can't tell the difference between a pervert and a trans woman.
Let's just talk. Okay, so if we're going to talk about,
you can't resist.
Yeah, no, that's oh my glob.
You can't resist.
Just for a second, John.
You can't.
Just we're going to talk about the thing you just said there at the end. But first, let's say we do this. Okay. And we change. It's no longer a woman's bathroom.
Then there's nothing stopping me.
Oh my God! I'm going to finish this sentence if it kills you.
Okay, go ahead.
If we change the word from woman's bathroom to female's bathroom now, same exact scenario. Who's checking?
Right. That's fine with the ones you can't identify and you can't tell. We're nobody's talking about that. We're talking about the ones that you get like, there's no way that you can trick us that you're a female or a woman. I don't care. Like, if you slip under the radar, that's one thing. But there's people who that is really a visual thing that people are having a problem with.
Right.
Of course,
and so what about? And so, John.
People do it all the time.
And so,
now.
John. What about trans men who are anatomically female but are big, meaty, muscular dude with beards and all these things, and they go into the female bathroom? How do you check to make sure that they're actually females and trans men because they're going in the female bathroom?
Okay. I agree. When you have to narrow it down to the little percent, I'm talking about just the typical person who again, we don't know what's typical as far as that goes, but I'm going based off of what I've seen when I see a trans woman. It's always somebody that is like, clearly this is a male.
It is always trans women because, as we covered earlier, it is the diarrhea martini of sexism and homophobia. My question to you, John, is
because I don't care. I don't care about that. I'm talking about, this has nothing to do with trans people. The whole point has nothing to do with trans people.
What you said a second ago is that any pervert, you can't tell the difference between a pervert and a trans person, right? That's what you said a second ago?
A trans woman, yeah.
Right. So what's the actual enemy here then? What's the actual thing you're worried about? You're worried that a cisgendered man, is going to pretend to be a woman in order to go into the bathroom and hurt people, right? That's the actual problem you have, right?
It don't have to hurt. No, it don't have to hurt, because somebody who's going to hurt somebody don't have to worry about dressing up as a woman. They'll just go right in. So it's not even that. Just somebody who wants to take pictures or whatever.
Sure. So then your problem, John, is with cisgendered men.
Yeah.
Your problem is with
I told you it has nothing to do with trans women or trans people. It has nothing to do with that.
I'm going to have to mute you if you can't quit interrupting me.
Okay. Yeah.
Your problem is with cisgendered men, and you are taking that problem out on transgender women by saying, because I can't separate. Okay, I'm just going to fucking mute you because you literally can't control yourself at this point. What you are doing is saying, I don't like what some cisgendered men could do. Therefore, because I personally don't know how to distinguish you from these other people who are just kind, honest people living their best lives, I'm going to now discriminate against them and cast aspersions against them and say that we need to have the female bathroom instead of the woman's bathroom, which then creates the exact same fucking problem, because you're going to have a lot of people that look like men walking into the female bathroom because they're trans men, and you're going to be more upset and have more confusion. And you're going to have cisgendered men who are perverts claiming to be transgender men to go in there instead of claiming to be transgender women. At the end of the day, your problem is with perverts. Don't try to make this a thing about sex and gender, and, well, we have to define these terms properly, and we should relabel these bathrooms, and, well, I need to figure out if gender seems so subjective, when the actual issue is that I don't fucking like perverts. And you know what, John? Neither do I. Nor does anybody.
I don't.
And when you can figure out a reliable way to keep creeps out of a bathroom, let's fucking do it. But trying to get the gender markers on the bathroom changed, or banning who goes to what bathroom, or changing from man and woman to male and female, none of that is going to change anything. It's going to put you in the exact same boat that you're in now, because at the end of the day, creeps are still creeps, and they're going to be creeps. That's all. That's all there is to it. So quit fucking pushing these bullshit transphobic talking points, whether or not you are transphobic. Quit pushing these transphobic talking points that are used by transphobes to justify their transphobia and hurt trans people, because transphobia hurts everybody. Because the second you start saying, oh, I think this person looks a little bit like a man, that means they might be trans, that means they might also be a pervert, and blah, blah, blah. Well, now, okay, well, this person is of a different race. They have different features that look a little more masculine. This person has a little bit more facial hair that's a little bit more prominent. This person has a darker skin color. This person has darker hair, whatever. This person has a little more of a doodly characteristics that I don't like. And now I have fucking Nancy Mace genital inspector with a fucking microscope out here checking everybody's business on the way to the bathroom. It's just fucking stupid. And it gets you absolutely nowhere good. And you're buying into bullshit rhetoric under the guise of just asking questions, and it's not doing anybody any good. So, John, we have spent over an hour answering mainly the same 3 questions. And I hope you go back and re-listen to this call and just see just how many times we define sex, we define gender, we define man, we define woman. We talked about links to sexuality. We talked about links to gender identity. We talked about links to gender performance. We talked about historical gender roles and norms. We talked about historical sexual roles and norms. We talked about all of these different things. And over and over and over and over, you kept going back to, yeah, but you don't know what women are. And like, dude, I'm sorry. We covered it. We covered it 1,000 times. and it's just not getting anywhere anymore. So if you want to talk to actual real live trans folks, call Takis. If you want to talk to me again and go a little bit more into this, feel free to call me back sometime, but we're going to move on from this call. Go watch my Sex and Sensibility video if you want to learn more about that as well. Have a good day, John. Do you have anything for John before I hang up on John?
That's all I got. I said my piece.
Okay. Bye, John. Yeah, it just didn't go anywhere, and it got real frustrating real fast at the end.
What you hate is pervert. So true. I couldn't have said it better myself. That really summed it up. It was, I was speaking in chat while you were doing the finishing monologue there, which I loved. I very much enjoyed. And I feel like everybody kind of picked up on the same point, which is that that was a very long-winded way to get around to I have this problem with perverts, and I'm not sure if it was always a pervert problem or if it was always a trans problem and the pervert is the costume to kind of put on. I can't tell the difference. Maybe I'm an idiot.
It is very difficult to say, and man, I hate when you have just layer after layer after layer after layer of just bullshit, empty rhetoric argument, and we're working. Like, I'm glad we took the call because there was a lot of stuff in there that are very common questions that people could learn from. But it sucks that all of that sophistry and rhetoric about like trying to understand and define these terms really just boiled down to some people are creepy, and that's every trans woman's problem. And like, you know what I mean? I can't do that.
I feel like too, if your issue is perverts, I promise you're not looking in the right place, right? Those perverts are hanging out in bars, roofing women's drinks, and they're hanging out in Congress, right? Like that's where they are.
Yeah.
That's where they need to be. That's where you need to be looking.
Wow, that was a great clip we just watched. Hey, Eve, what should the people do now?
Leave a comment, click like, subscribe, patreon.com/ does that say call the line?
Yeah. But if you could have made, we could just make it a little more natural. On the next clip, the outro will be much better.